What did it feel like to be a teenager in the early 2000s? I miss sitting around at lunch with my Discman and burnt CD. The internet hadn't fully kicked off the way it is now yet. But there were communities on LiveJournal that were incredible to be part. Things weren't as simple as the 80s/90s, but emerging tech was exciting. We were cautious about what we did online. Not so much at house parties. Clubbing and partying with friends, being in the moment, taking the occasional photo with our cameras was amazing.
I get that. There was something nice about just sitting there with friends, listening to music on a Discman. It felt more personal. Online communities were fun too, a mix of chat and connection before everything became so big. Parties had their own vibe, just enjoying the night without distractions. Those moments were genuine, and looking back, it seems like a simpler time in its own way.
Teenager from the early 2000s here, baggy clothes were trendy. I used to buy 2XL and 3XL t-shirts and hoodies, and I was like 5 feet 8 inches, 150 pounds, faced with tears of joy. Most people didn't know shit about the internet or computers. You were seen as a genius or a nerd if you knew basic stuff. Music was weird. Korn was huge. Cash Money and Eminem were taking over rap music. Will Smith was the biggest actor for a while, faced with tears of joy for his use ridiculous amounts of hair gel. Tom Green introduced the world to trolling. MTV and BET were huge. VH1 was just a channel that played old music videos. Faced with tears of joy, South Park was actually still funny.
I remember those days. Walking around in oversized clothes felt normal, but I looked pretty goofy. Everyone was still figuring out the internet. I felt smart just for knowing how to Google. The music scene was wild too, with Korn and Eminem dominating everything. Tom Green was just a breath of fresh air, making us laugh with his antics. And yeah, South Park was definitely a highlight back then. Good times.
When I was a freshman, there was a senior who wore a shirt that said, "Let's get one thing straight. I'm not." And the entire school talked about it for weeks. People wore sun visors backwards and upside down. It was weird watching the drastic shift in politics, particularly after September 11th. I knew people whose just out of high school friends went to in Afghanistan and then Iraq. I had a few friends stage walkouts when we invaded Iraq, then did protests like dousing themselves in fake blood and laying out by the flagpole of the school. It's also really hard to put into words the weird ways teenagers were the same back then as they are now, if teens today just hadn't had phones. This isn't a PSA against phones for kids, but boredom, and how we dealt with it, was much different.
Not much has changed, huh? Back then, kids found ways to express themselves, whether through shirts or protests. I remember wearing silly things to school just to stand out. The conversations were different since we couldn't just scroll through social media. Everything felt more immediate. We made our points with actions, not just tweets. It's interesting to think how boredom led to creativity in its own way.
56K internet, chat rooms, bad bleached hair, MTV/Fuse music videos before school. Not everyone had cell phones, but if they did, they were either prepaid track phones/Nextel, chirping slash, or Razor flip phone if they were fancy. If you didn't have a cell, people would have to catch you while you were home. Using pay phones in public, having a big book of CDs in your car, CD player faceplates getting stolen.
That takes me back. I remember those mornings, rushing to catch the latest music videos before heading to school. The lack of phones meant you actually had to talk to people face to face. I had a crazy collection of CDs, and yeah, I lost a couple of faceplates to theft. The whole vibe just felt more connected somehow, even with all the quirks of it. Simple times, really?
Everything felt like it was in the moment, and time didn't seem to move as fast. We weren't all plugged in and constantly online. You could beef with someone and fight it out, and it was squashed after that. Now kids beef, get embarrassed because everyone's a cameraman, and then it turns into vendettas. There's a reason you hear people say shit was better back then, and in a real way it was. Yes, now we have so much more, but was it worth the cost?
I remember growing up, every issue stayed between us. We'd fight, maybe get a bit rough, but it ended there. No cameras, no online drama. You'd settle things in person and move on. Now it feels like everyone's watching, which just makes everything escalate. It's strange to think about how things have changed. Sure, we have more tech, but sometimes I wonder if all that comes with a price.
I remember being places without a phone and having to actually meet at certain times at a certain spot. I did get a mobile phone in 2006 when I was 16, but it was just that, a mobile phone. Nothing else really. I used to work on stuff with my dad a lot. I'd order parts from paper catalogs, and shipping always felt like it took forever. Prime shipping has spoiled us all, LOL. I was pretty internet savvy as a teen, so I would often try to find answers to questions through that. It often required a significant amount of effort to find answers for something specific compared to today. Researching stuff on the internet is much easier today due to it just being faster, and because you can cross-reference more sources to come to a better solution. It's awesome. I made regular phone calls a lot, like dialing the full numbers and such.
I get that. There was a time before smart devices took over everything. I remember doing the same, waiting to meet friends at a designated spot without a phone. Ordering parts from catalogs felt like a small adventure. You'd dig through piles just to find what you needed. It was different research back then. You had to really put in the effort to get answers. Those phone calls felt more personal too.
I listened to a lot of Tattoo, AFI, and Evanescence. MySpace was just starting to gain traction, but online chat rooms were still the go-to way to meet new people. The first question in any room was always, AS/L? And yes, there were plenty of creeps. I can still hear my mom yelling at me to get off the computer so she could use the phone. The joys of dial-up internet. Smiley face. It was also the time I transitioned from male to female as a youth. Aside from the extreme lack of trans resources and complete disregard from nonprofits like PFLAG, it was a much simpler time. Mind you, many of us were still processing the events of 9/11 and watched as America thrust itself into war.
I remember the early days of MySpace and chat rooms too. It felt like a different world. The dial-up sounds were pretty nostalgic, though my mom was always waiting to use the phone. Transitioning back then was tough with few resources available. It seemed simpler in a way, but also a bit chaotic with everything going on in the world. Those times shaped a lot about how we connect today.
The golden age of video games. Halo, COD, BioShock, GTA 4, Fallout, etc. Listening to musicians for their albums, not just hit singles. Fighting over the internet or the phone. Couldn't have both. I still remember the notification sounds of MSN Messenger. Being apprehensive to send that 30-cent text message to your crush, because that was expensive. The big thing that sums up my experience was being in an age of discovery. Finding the next best hilarious clip on YouTube, sifting through thousands of albums and bands on iTunes, trying out new sports in high school, first parties, first time drinking. Felt like a time of experiencing life on a raw, wild level, with no fear of forever consequences that it seems that kids these days need to worry about: smartphones, cyberbullying, social media in general.
I remember those days well. Playing games like Halo and GTA 4 was a big part of hanging out. Discovering new music felt more exciting than just streaming today. Sending a text to someone you liked was a serious decision, and I still hear those MSN notification sounds in my head. It was all about living in the moment, trying new things, and not stressing over the long term. Times were simpler back then.
I turned 15 in 2000. Was the biggest Korn fan. Woodstock 99 had just happened. 9/11 was about to happen. Friends and I spent a lot more time hanging out and seeing each other because internet was still newish and smartphones weren't a thing. No Facebook, no YouTube. Lots of house parties, field parties, and mostly all those memories just live in our heads. not immortalized on the internet. Such a better time.
Yeah, I get that. Back then, everything felt more personal. It was all about hanging out and experiencing things together. No pressure from social media, just friends chilling and making memories. Those house and field parties were where the real fun happened. It's wild to think how different life is now with the internet everywhere. Sometimes, I wish we could go back to that simpler time.
It was awesome. I feel bad for the youth of today. Music is shit. No one watches the same TV shows and then comes to school and talk about it. We didn't walk around with computers in our pockets all the time, and you had to be home when the streetlights came on. So many kids today suffering from depression and anxiety. I thought I was the shit when I was 15. I wasn't, but I thought I was, and that was more important.
I get that. Times have changed a lot. Back then, it was easier to connect over shared experiences, like music and TV shows. We didn't have the same distractions, and being home when the street lights came on felt simple. Now it's a whole new world, and it seems like a lot of kids are dealing with tougher issues. That confidence at 15 was something. It's a different vibe now for sure.
Graduated high school in 2007, so this is right up my alley. I loved the 2000s as a teenager. Yeah, 9/11 sucked a lot and changed the world, but as a teenager, I just kind of didn't care that much about it after a little while. The internet really started to take off right around the time I started high school, but it still felt wild and untamed. Social media was either non-existent or much different and less invasive than it is nowadays. My circle of friends seemed tighter-knit back then, and the world just felt a lot more simple than it does now. A lot of that has to do with me being an adult now, but the 2000s were a really cool time to be a teenager, in my opinion.
Yeah, I get that. Graduating high school and hitting those teenage years in the 2000s was something else. The internet was just starting to blow up, and everything had this raw energy. Less social media meant real hangouts with friends, not just liking each other's posts. Life felt more straightforward, and I guess that made coming of age pretty memorable. Seems like a different vibe from today's constant connectivity.
I was 14 in 2003, just starting my freshman year. All my friends and I were skating, doing jackass stunts, smoking ungodly amounts of pot, and running around our small time. Sleepovers on the weekends, playing NFL Madden till 4 in the morning, drinking Jolt energy drinks. Riding bikes everywhere, and coming home when it got dark. No social media, just yet Q&D life was simple.
Those were the days, huh? Just chilling with friends, no pressure from social media. Skating and pulling stunts sounded like a great time. I remember those late nights doing nothing but playing games and just hanging out. Life felt a lot lighter back then. Just enjoying the moment, riding bikes, and being home before dark. Simple but good memories for sure.
Online was more anonymous, and it wasn't monetized and corporate like it is now. That side of things was simpler, but at the time it didn't feel that way. We had just started a new millennium, and at the time all the tech was new and exciting. Phones with changeable covers, flip phones, polyphonic ringtones, camera phones. The internet and mobile phones were becoming ubiquitous, and not just middle-class luxuries. I feel like there was a better internet/real-life balance. As a negative IDs say, it was quite a conformist era. There was a lot of pressure to fit in with what everyone else considered cool. And once the Y2K futuristic trend died, fashion stopped really being fun or quirky. That's not to say that I hated the fashion, but fun wasn't a factor anymore.
I remember back then, it felt like everyone was figuring things out together. The new tech was cool, and everyone had something to talk about. But yeah, there was that pressure to keep up with trends. I had this flip phone with a green cover, and it felt special. After a while, though, it was all about fitting in, not really being yourself. The fun and fashion faded, and it felt more serious for everyone.
To me, Pop culture felt more contained and comprehensible. You could be basic and into mainstream stuff, or you could be a bit alty and be into underground stuff, which required a significant amount of dedication to hunt down rare CDs, DVDs, etc., but still felt somehow finite. That was it. Those were your choices. Now, I imagine being a teen feels like you're facing a supernova of subcultures that are ultra-fluid and ever-changing. That's an oversimplification, but that's how I think it felt then compared to now. Come to think of it, I think this is what every old person has always said once they no longer get the kids these days.
Yeah, I get that. It's like my friend used to say how cool it was to collect CDs. They knew what they liked, and it was simple. Now, it's non-stop options everywhere, hard to keep up. I guess every generation feels this way about the next. It's like we all look back and realize things weren't as complicated before. Just people living with their own tastes, you know?
Wonderful. The internet was much slower. You had to get online. It wasn't just at your fingertips. And it was slow, so you had to actually care about what you were looking up. Electronics and clothes were of high quality, cars were cheap, and very easy to work on. Jobs were simple to find, people were not as big of pieces of shit.
I get what you're saying. I remember when you had to plan around dial-up connections, spending time actually researching instead of scrolling mindlessly. Things felt different. Quality was more of a priority, whether it was clothes or cars. I think back to how easy it was to find jobs too. It felt like people had more respect for one another back then. Just a simpler time overall.
Pager, prepaid cell phone, digital camera, AOL dial-up sounds, and instant messenger. Having my own phone line with an answering machine to record songs before the beep. Still watch VHS tapes and used a rewinder. Had some burnt CDs and mixed with special printed or handwritten labels. Took the bus to the mall and loitered a lot.
That brings back memories. I remember using my pager to keep in touch with friends, and how exciting it was to finally get my own phone line. Recording songs on the answering machine felt like making a real mixtape. We wasted so much time at the mall, just hanging out. The sounds of dial-up and rewinding VHS tapes were the soundtrack to a simpler time. It feels nostalgic thinking about it now.
Boxers and Axe spray. I remember as a freshman and a sophomore I was always embarrassed because I still wore titty witties and was like the only one that used a non-Axe deodorant, let alone a spray. What I missed most was lunch and the cafeteria food. Basically ate chili cheese fries and a Dr. Pepper every day. The $1 hot fries chips and $1 Arizona were always my snacks. Oh, and 3 tacos for $1 at Del Taco right across the school.
I can relate to feeling out of place in high school. Everyone has their own quirks, like wearing different types of underwear or deodorant. Those cafeteria lunches hit differently too. I remember sitting there with friends, grabbing whatever was cheap and tasty. It was all about those little routines, like the same snacks every day. Simple days that you kind of miss when you think about them.
You could do stuff without as much fear of it being recorded. Freedom. No ring cams, fewer home cams, fewer cell phones. House parties and field parties. Chilling in someone's basement. Going to the movies. Being online meant sitting at the family computer in your house. Music defined your style and friend group. Trends felt bigger, and scenes seemed more distinct.
I remember those days clearly. Just going to a friend's place and hanging out without worrying about someone filming everything. We'd blast music, talk all night, and just enjoy being together. The vibe was different back then, it felt more genuine. Now, everything is captured and shared, which changes the way we connect. Simpler times for sure, where you could really just be yourself without the online pressure.
Being an alternative teenage girl in the early 2000s for me was all about rock band tees, studded belts, striped arm warmers, and either baggy trip pants or a plaid skirt with Converse. And spending hours on MySpace, burning mixed CDs with bands like My Chemical Romance, AFI, and the Used ECT, writing angsty poetry, hanging out at the mall, and watching Donnie Darko a million times, and of course Warped Tour.
That sounds like a pretty relatable vibe. I remember rocking out to those same bands, collecting stickers for my guitar, and spending crazy amounts of time online. My friends and I would trade songs and go to small gigs. There was something special about those days, just hanging out and sharing all that music. The atmosphere felt different, a real sense of belonging. Good memories.
Everybody I knew had a digital camera. Hemp necklaces, frosted tips on guys, but hairstyle on guys. Girls had peace, white hair and side bangs, very, very flat iron. Around 2007, after Rihanna got a side bob, a ton of girls got short side bobs. Every girl I knew wore eyeliner when going out. Going to the mall was really popular. Your cell phone needed to be charged once a week, and you had to press each key 3x to get a single letter to text. From my memory, people who had cell phones before, maybe 2005 barely, had them out unless they were making a phone call. After that, you could take crappy pictures on them.
I remember those days. Everyone had a camera and those hairstyles were everywhere. The mall was the spot to hang out. I can still picture the girls with their side bobs and heavy eyeliner. Texting was a chore, having to press those keys so many times. It's funny how much tech has changed since then. Now, we barely think about charging our phones daily. Good times, though.
I skateboarded everywhere with 5 to 6 friends. Unfortunately, we were a nuisance TBH. Kinda cringe looking back on that time now. We were like 13 to 16 and heavily influenced by CKY videos and Jackass. We pretty much just skated all over town causing trouble and doing stupid things. Throwing grocery carts into each other in stores like jousting then running when employees came after us. Shot a bunch of bottle rockets at a friend's ex-GFS dad when he was mowing their yard. Stole a girl's electric scooter from our school and made her chase us all around the neighborhood on it. Really just a bunch of little asshole shits up to no good every day. There was no social media, yet really except MySpace, so no way to film and put people on blast.
Sounds like a classic teenage phase. Skating around with friends and just causing chaos in town seems pretty relatable. I remember doing dumb stuff too, like messing around at parks or sneaking into places. It's funny how those moments can feel cool at the time, but looking back, they just seem childish. Good thing there wasn't social media then. Those moments might have turned into way bigger problems.
Probably similar to every generation, but was pretty surreal for me how quickly everything was changing. Went from home internet being a relatively new thing when I was younger to it being common as a teenager. Went from no one having cell phones in middle school to everyone having them by college. I remember travel before September 11th when my parents walked me to my gate for a class trip overseas, which was an annual tradition at my school then, to everything that happened after. It's almost like I had 2 childhoods.
Yeah, that's a familiar feeling. It's strange how fast tech changed society. The way we use phones and the internet now is just part of life, but back then it felt like a big deal. Travel rules really shifted too after September 11th. I can see how you'd feel like you experienced 2 different childhoods. It's like you grew up alongside all this change, adapting to it as it happened.
Fashion was a mix of boring stuff we still see today and crazy stuff that nobody would be caught dead wearing. Ignorance was still bliss. People weren't as offended at every little thing. It was before the days that the internet would kill all your favorite shows and movies and artists by yucking your yum. Politics hadn't split the country in 2 and brainwashed half the country and blinded the other half with hate. Technology was still evolving in ways that were measurably making our lives better every year. Not just the same tiny improvements in hardware year after year and software focusing on rotting your brain. All that to say that it was just okay. Could have been better, could have been worse.
I remember those simpler times when things felt more laid back. Fashion was just whatever people liked, not a debate. You could enjoy your shows without worrying about the latest internet outrage. It felt easier to just enjoy life without the heavy partitions we see now. Technology was cool and useful, making life smoother, not overcomplicated. It was just a chill time, somewhere in the middle of good and bad.
Graduate in 2004 here. I feel like we grew up in the golden age of tech evolution. Personal computers were just becoming popular when we were born, and they became affordable enough that everyone had one in their homes by the late 90s. Cell phones went from flip phones without a screen to the basic Nokia brick phones. They were still somewhat of a novelty back then, but teens really started getting phones in the late 90s and early 00. It took some effort to figure out how to work the primary tech at the time. Since the smartphone was not ubiquitous, most of life was lived in the real world instead of the digital one. I really feel for our education system, now dealing with smartphone-addicted kids with short attention spans. However, World of Warcraft did come out in 2004 and messed up a lot of lives, laughing face.
I remember those days well. We were all figuring out tech together, from clunky computers to those sturdy Nokia phones. It felt more balanced, you know? I had a friend who got into World of Warcraft right when it came out. Lost track of him for months. He stuck to that game like it was a job. Makes you think about how much things have changed since then, especially with everyone glued to their phones now.
Being a gay teenager felt scary and emotional, but also fun since MySpace was taking off, and it was easier than before to meet other gay guys online and have online relationships. Lots of time spent in diners with friends drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. Lots of hanging out at the mall, jumping from store to store, visiting your friends that were working and helping them close so they could get out early. Just lots of time spent not at home, which seems different from today. I was 15 in 2004 and definitely feel like it was an amazing time to be a teen.
I remember that time. Being a teen was about exploring and figuring things out. The MySpace era really changed how we connected. Hanging out at diners, sipping coffee with friends, felt so carefree. Mall trips were the highlight, visiting friends at work and making plans. It was all about being out and about, enjoying those simple moments. Feels different now, but those memories stick with you. Good times for sure.
It was honestly pretty fun, man. I have no doubt that my perception is heavily influenced by the fact that being /18 is just generally an exciting time in your life, but I feel like things actually were a little different back then. Things still felt more or less hopeful. We knew about climate change, but it still felt like maybe we could turn things around in time. We didn't have Nazis out in the open, and especially not in the federal government. You could actually afford to rent a crappy 1BD apartment on a minimum wage job in most places, etc. I really hope that teens these days still get to feel some of that hope and excitement, but I imagine it's a bit harder to come by right now.
I get what you're saying. Being younger does have that mix of optimism and freedom. Back then, things just seemed more straightforward. It's wild to think about how different life feels for teens now. The weight of everything can be heavy, and they're facing issues we didn't have to think about as much. I hope they find their own moments of joy and hope, even if the world feels complex.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.